Picture a developer in Seattle. It is June of 2026, and he is logging into Microsoft's Azure cloud to spin up a new server. He picks his operating system from the menu. And there, sitting between Ubuntu and Red Hat, is a Linux distribution built entirely by Microsoft. He selects it without thinking twice. That moment would have seemed impossible 25 years ago. It would have been a scandal. Because the company now shipping Linux is the same company whose CEO once stood up and called Linux a cancer. So, the question this video is going to answer is this: did Microsoft finally change? Or is what we're watching right now the most patient and perfectly executed corporate takeover of an open technology in the history of the software industry? There is one detail buried in the history of this story: a set of internal Microsoft documents that leaked on Halloween night in 1998 that changes everything about how you interpret what Microsoft just announced. We are going to get to those documents, and by the time we do, you will understand why some of the most experienced people in the technology world are not celebrating this news. More than 2/3 of all customer computing cores running on Microsoft's Azure cloud today are running Linux, not Windows, Linux. The operating system Microsoft's own CEO once called a cancer is now the majority operating system on Microsoft's own cloud platform. And the platforms running Microsoft 365, GitHub, and OpenAI's ChatGPT are all built on Linux foundations. That is not a minor footnote. That means the core of Microsoft's entire cloud business, the engine generating the revenue that is now keeping the company relevant, depends entirely on an operating system that Microsoft spent the better part of a decade trying to destroy. Every time Microsoft sells you a cloud service, a subscription, an Azure product, there is a strong chance the machine running it is a Linux machine. Microsoft has been a Linux company for years. They just never said it out loud. On May the 18th, 2026, at the Open Source Summit in Minneapolis, they finally said it out loud. Microsoft announced Azure Linux 4.0, a Fedora-based general-purpose Linux distribution built by Microsoft, maintained by Microsoft, and now available for any customer to run on any Azure virtual machine. Not just for containers, not just for internal infrastructure, a real Linux distribution, available to the public, with Microsoft's name on it. This is Microsoft declaring itself a Linux vendor. The strategy Microsoft used to destroy Netscape, to neutralize Java, and to nearly kill the open web, that strategy has a name. It was documented inside Microsoft itself, and the document that described it was leaked the night before Halloween in 1998. To understand what is happening in 2026, you have to go back to 1998 and understand a man named Vinod Velopalil. Velopalil was a program manager at Microsoft. In August of 1998, he wrote a confidential internal memo for senior executives Jim Allchin and Paul Maritz. The memo was titled Open Source Software, a New Development Methodology. It was marked Microsoft Confidential. It was never supposed to leave the building. 2 months later, someone leaked it to Eric Raymond, a prominent voice in the open source software community. Raymond published it on his website on October 31st, Halloween. The memo became known as the first Halloween document. What it said was extraordinary. Velopalil was not dismissing Linux. He was warning Microsoft's leadership that Linux was a serious, credible, long-term threat to Microsoft's dominance. He wrote that Linux represented the first time in history that a development model had emerged capable of challenging Microsoft's intellectual property-based revenues. He was scared. And he was right. The memo outlined 3 possible strategies for neutralizing open-source software. The third strategy was given a name inside Microsoft. That name was Embrace, Extend, Extinguish. The logic was simple. Step 1. Embrace the open technology. Adopt it publicly, support it, become part of the community. Build goodwill, become trusted. Step 2. Extend it. Build your own version with proprietary additions, features that only work properly inside your ecosystem. Step 3. Extinguish. Once enough developers and companies have standardized on your extended version, the original open version starts to fall behind. The community that built it fragments. Your version becomes the default. and you own what used to be free. This was a documented Microsoft strategy written by a Microsoft employee, authenticated by Microsoft, and later submitted as evidence in federal antitrust proceedings. Paul Maritz, a senior Microsoft vice president, had used the phrase himself in conversations with Intel executives years before the document leaked. Microsoft had already run this play once. Against Netscape. Microsoft embraced the web browser, extended Internet Explorer with Windows-only features, bundled it for free with every copy of Windows, and within 5 years, Netscape was gone. The United States Department of Justice took Microsoft to court over it. Microsoft lost. The judge found that Microsoft had illegally maintained its monopoly. So when Linux started growing, Valapillil sat down and wrote a memo asking, "Can we do it again?" Now fast forward to today, and ask yourself what it looks like when step 1 of that strategy is being executed at scale. The year that changes this story is 2014. That is the year Satya Nadella became CEO of Microsoft. And almost immediately, he said 3 words that nobody at Microsoft had ever said before. He said, "Microsoft loves Linux." The message was clear. The old Microsoft was dead. The new Microsoft was going to be a partner to the open source community, not an adversary. In 2016, Microsoft joined the Linux Foundation as a platinum member, paying $500,000 a year for a seat on the board of directors, the organization that controls the Linux trademark and funds the people maintaining the Linux kernel itself. That same year, Microsoft shipped the Windows subsystem for Linux, bringing a real Linux environment inside Windows for the first time. In 2018, Microsoft acquired GitHub for $7.5 billion in stock. GitHub is not just a website. GitHub is where the overwhelming majority of the world's software is written, stored, reviewed, and published. It is the infrastructure of open source development. When Microsoft bought it, the Linux Foundation's own executive director praised the deal. The community celebrated. The old enemy had become a patron. By 2019, Linux was running more Azure machines than Windows was. Microsoft had quietly become the largest commercial user of Linux on the planet. And then, in May of 2026, the final step. Microsoft announced Azure Linux 4.0, its own distribution. Publicly available. Named after their cloud platform. Built specifically to run best on Azure. Any developer who now standardizes on Azure Linux for their production workloads is running a Linux distribution that is maintained by Microsoft, optimized for Microsoft's cloud, and tested against Microsoft's infrastructure. The moment you go deep into Azure Linux, moving to a different cloud gets harder. Is Microsoft genuinely a friend to Linux now, or is a 25-year-old strategy playing out in slow motion exactly as its authors intended? Continue watching to find the answer. The GitHub acquisition is the move that most people underestimate. When Microsoft bought GitHub in 2018, the conversation was mostly about money and developer tools. But step back and look at what GitHub actually is. As of the most recent data, GitHub hosts over 518 million public and open source projects. More than 1 billion contributions were made on the platform in a single year. The overwhelming majority of active Linux development, open source tooling, and cloud infrastructure projects live on GitHub. When a developer contributes to an open source project today, there is a very strong chance they are doing it through infrastructure that Microsoft owns. Microsoft did not just buy a code hosting service. It bought the front door to the open source world. And it did not stop there. Microsoft became a platinum member of the Linux Foundation, a paying board member of the organization that governs the Linux kernel itself. It became a premium sponsor of the open source initiative. It put its own employees into senior positions in open source organizations and on critical infrastructure projects. One observer tracking this trajectory put it plainly, if you want to control a technology, you find the people working on it and put them on your payroll. Now it is 2026. If you are still running Windows today, and there are hundreds of millions of you, this is where the story touches you directly. Microsoft is not just building Linux for cloud developers. At Build 2026, Microsoft announced that it is bringing over 75 Linux command line tools natively into Windows itself, based on an open source project called Utils. a full rewrite of the standard Unix toolset in the Rust programming language. The same Linux utilities that have run on every serious server for 30 years are now being folded into Windows. Microsoft is building the Linux experience into Windows from the inside. The pattern is visible if you know what you are looking for. Embrace, Microsoft loves Linux, joins the foundation, buys GitHub. Extend, Microsoft builds its own Linux distro, its own container system, its own Linux tools inside Windows, all optimized for Azure. The third step in that original strategy was Extinguish. We have not reached that point yet, and there is a real argument that we never will. But before we get to the honest analysis of both cases, there is one story from the real world that puts a human face on what it means to trust a platform, and then watch it change direction. In 2020, Microsoft's president Brad Smith stood up publicly and said something that very few executives at major corporations ever say. He admitted that Microsoft had been on the wrong side of history when open source exploded. Not a quiet correction, a public acknowledgement. The wrong side of history. Think about what that statement actually covers. In the years when Microsoft was executing the strategy Volapilil described in 1998, real companies were making real decisions based on Microsoft's messaging. They chose Windows Server because Microsoft said Linux was legally dangerous, intellectually contaminated, unsuitable for professional use. Steve Ballmer did not say that casually. He said it to the Chicago Sun-Times on June 1, 2001, on the record, "Linux is a cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches." That was the CEO of the most powerful software company in the world, telling every IT manager and every purchasing director in America that choosing Linux was choosing the wrong side. Some of those IT managers listened. They locked their organizations into Windows infrastructure. They turned down open source alternatives. They built their technology stacks around the assumption that Microsoft's ecosystem was the safe, professional, legally defensible choice. And then Microsoft's own business model changed beneath them. Azure became a Linux cloud. Windows became less central to Microsoft's revenue every year. The Windows-centric world those managers had built their careers around started to look less like the future. And now, in 2026, Microsoft is shipping its own Linux. The company that told you Linux was a cancer is now asking you to run their version of it on their cloud, through their GitHub, maintained by their engineers. Brad Smith said Microsoft was on the wrong side of history. What he did not say, what nobody at Microsoft will say, is whether this new direction is a genuine conversion or whether it is the most sophisticated execution of the same strategy that destroyed Netscape. If you are a developer being asked to standardize your infrastructure on Azure Linux today, that question is not abstract. It is the question your career may depend on getting right. Because here is what the pattern raises. When a company with Microsoft's documented history tells you to trust their version of something that was free, open, and owned by nobody, what do you do? That is the question both cases have to answer. There are two futures possible from this moment. Both are consistent with the verified facts. I am going to lay them both out. In the first future, Microsoft's transformation is genuine. Satya Nadella inherited a company that had spent a decade losing wars it should never have fought against Linux, against open source, against the web. He looked at where the cloud industry had gone, built entirely on open standards, running Linux everywhere, and concluded that Microsoft's survival depended on becoming part of that ecosystem rather than fighting it. The GitHub acquisition, the Linux Foundation membership, Azure Linux 4.0, these are the actions of a company that understood it was too late to extinguish anything, and decided to compete by being genuinely useful instead. In this future, developers who choose Azure Linux get a well-maintained, security-hardened, open-source distribution backed by one of the largest engineering organizations on Earth. And the open-source community gets a serious contributor helping to harden infrastructure that everyone depends on. That case is real. The evidence for it is real. Microsoft's contributions to the Linux kernel, to Kubernetes, to open source tooling are documented and substantial. You can verify them yourself on GitHub today. In the second future, the Halloween document is not ancient history. It is a roadmap. Embrace, extend, extinguish was not a failed strategy. It was a strategy that Microsoft was forced to abandon on one battlefield before completing it, because the antitrust case went against them. In this future, the GitHub acquisition is step 1 of the control layer. Azure Linux is step 2. The 75 Linux tools folded into Windows are part of a longer arc toward a world where the Linux that developers use, trust, and standardize on is a Linux that Microsoft maintains, Microsoft hosts, and Microsoft can subtly tune over time. Not through force, through convenience, through being the path of least resistance. In this future, the extinguish step does not look like killing Linux. It looks like owning the version of Linux that matters. The honest answer is this: Microsoft says it loves Linux. It has said that for over a decade now, and the evidence of genuine contribution is real. But the Halloween documents are also real. The Netscape story is real. Brad Smith's admission that Microsoft was on the wrong side of history is real. And the pattern, embrace, extend, pause, is visible if you choose to look at it. Whether step 3 ever comes depends entirely on whether Microsoft's business incentives continue to align with open source health, or whether the moment arrives when controlling the dominant version of Linux is worth more to Microsoft than maintaining the goodwill of the community that built it. History says watch what they do, not what they say. Right now, what they are doing is building the infrastructure to make step 3 possible. Whether they ever execute it is the question nobody can answer yet. So, did Microsoft finally change? The evidence of genuine transformation is real. The contributions are real. The code is open. The investment is substantial. A company that wanted to secretly strangle Linux would not be contributing to the Linux kernel, funding open source security work through the OpenSSF, and publishing every deviation it makes from Fedora in a public GitHub repository. But the architecture of influence that Microsoft has built since 2014, owning GitHub, sitting on the Linux Foundation board, maintaining the Linux distribution that runs the most important cloud infrastructure in the world, that architecture would also be exactly what you would build if you were executing the original Halloween document strategy with more patience and more sophistication than anyone thought possible in 1998. Both things can be true simultaneously. Microsoft may be a genuine open source partner that also happens to be building exactly the control layer it would need if it ever decided not to be. What that means for you right now, if you are a developer or a technology decision maker, is this: do not dismiss Azure Linux. It is a serious, well-built distribution with real engineering behind it, but do not let the goodwill of the last decade erase the memory of what Microsoft documented about itself when it thought nobody was reading. Trust, but verify. In open source, verification is built in. Use it,